never know what you'll discover in Missouri from the air. When you race across the waters of its Big Muddy, peer down on fields that look like giant works of art from high above, and soar down the Mississippi Flyway with one of the most graceful creatures in the world. But the peaceful beauty of Missouri can be deceiving. It was here where the deadliest twister in U.S. history devastated an entire city in seconds, where massive earthquakes terrified settlers into thinking that the world was coming to an end, and where a police encounter ended in tragedy and sparked protests across the nation. But it was also in Missouri that a young Mark Twain turned memories of life on the Mississippi into the stories that made him a literary legend, and where a slave's pursuit of freedom ended with a shocking verdict that helped trigger the Civil War. Missouri is a state anchored by two great cities, St. Louis in the east and Kansas City in the west, where rival home state teams faced off in Game 7 of the World Series. A talented animator first came up with the idea for a mouse named Mickey, and a rebel spirit earned it the nickname Paris of the Plains. This is the colorful world of the Show Me State, Missouri. Missouri's greatest natural treasures is the Ozarks, especially in the fall, when these green mountains are transformed into a blanket of red, orange, and gold. The Ozarks aren't your typical mountains. In fact, some geologists don't actually consider them to be mountains at all. That's because they weren't created by catastrophic events like volcanoes, or from tectonic plates clashing deep below. Missouri's Ozarks were created by erosion instead. Hundreds of millions of years ago, when this region was still covered by the sea, a giant area of what's now Missouri was slowly pushed upwards into a towering plateau. Then, over millions of years, water from rain and snow began eating away at the land, gradually creating the valleys and peaks that we call the Ozarks today. During that process of erosion, great globs of rock emerged from the earth. Nature has placed some of these giant boulders on display here at a place called Elephant Rock State Park. These towering granite forms are thought to be more than 1 billion years old. They were named elephant rocks since they stand in a line, like a row of circus elephants. The largest is known as Dumbo and is 27 feet tall. The scale of these massive boulders can be hard to grasp from the air until you see them next to the visitors who come to be awed by Missouri's rich geological past. But there's another awe-inspiring form in Missouri, one that's made St. Louis one of the most easily recognized cities in the world. Its stunning Gateway Arch. Just one glance at the arch on the banks of the Mississippi River, and everyone knows this is St. Louis. More than half a century after it was built, it remains one of the nation's great engineering marvels. It was born from economic chaos. In the 1930s, during the Depression, unemployment rates in St. Louis were high. So city officials started looking for ways for St. Louis to get its hands on some of the federal cash being handed out under the New Deal. They managed to convince President Roosevelt and New Deal officials to fund a new riverfront park and memorial to President Thomas Jefferson and his leading role in America's westward expansion. St. Louis then launched a design competition for a new memorial on the site. The winner was a Finnish-American architect and designer named Eero Saarinen. His monumental arch seemed the perfect symbol of the opening up of the West and a way to frame the growing city of St. Louis. It took 900 tons of stainless steel to build. Reportedly, the largest order of stainless steel in U.S. history. On October 28, 1965, thousands of excited St. Louis residents gathered below as a team of daring steelworkers hoisted themselves up to the top of the arch and then welded the final section of steel into place. Saarinen's engineering marvel was complete. Today, 2.5 million visitors ride futuristic trams to the top every year for a chance to peer out of its tiny angled windows and across the Mississippi River and the states of Missouri and Illinois. It's now considered a major world monument. Its price tag of $13 million was a huge amount of money for a city like St. Louis to spend on a structure that had no practical use. That's one reason the arch is much more than a memorial. It's a powerful symbol of a unique time in the nation when political power and public funds worked together to build soaring monuments that affirmed America's leading place in the world. For the people of St. Louis, the Gateway Arch has given them an indelible brand. And looking back through Saarinen's upside-down catenary curve today, it remains a gateway to the West, just as St. Louis once was more than 2 centuries ago. The city of St. Louis was founded here on the west bank of the Mississippi River in 1764 by French fur traders. At the time, St. Louis and all the land that would become Missouri was actually in Spanish territory. But it wasn't long before American settlers started exploring what Missouri had to offer. One of those was an American frontiersman named Daniel Boone, who would gain fame opening up Kentucky to settlers. In 1799, Boone left Kentucky and arrived in Missouri. The Boones built a massive stone house here in what's now the town of Defiance. School children flock here from miles around to learn about what life was once like on the Missouri frontier. The house was built with 2.5-foot thick stone walls to protect Boone and his family from attack by members of Missouri's Indian tribes. From this house, Boone witnessed the historic events that would make Missouri a U.S. territory. In 1800, Spain turned over the Louisiana Territory to France. 3 years later, France sold it to the U.S. for $15 million. It included all of what's now the state of Missouri. The next year, the legendary explorers Lewis and Clark arrived at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. They were the first European Americans to map and document the Missouri interior. It wasn't easy going. During much of their journey upriver, they didn't sail or even row. They trudged along the river's banks, pulling their boats with ropes instead. As they worked their way upriver, William Clark noticed a spot high above the banks of the Missouri that would make a good site for a U.S. fort. After the expedition, Clark returned to build a fort and trading post here in 1808. First named Fort Clark, but later known as Fort Osage, it was one of the first outposts of the U.S. government west of the Mississippi River and turned Missouri into the gateway to the West. The problem was, Native American tribes like the Great and Little Osage, who already lived here, were seen as a threat to the new settlers. So Clark and the U.S. government started trying to convince the tribes to give up their lands. In the fall and early winter of 1808, while Fort Osage was still being constructed, representatives of the government convinced the chiefs of the Great and Little Osage nations to sign away roughly 50,000 square miles of land forever. In return, they were promised $1,500 in cash a year, and that they could still live and hunt here. The treaties guaranteed that the tribes would be protected by the U.S. government. But as a flood of settlers arrived in the region, hungry for more and more land, those promises were quickly broken. Over time, the tribes were forced out of Missouri forever and onto a reservation in Oklahoma. It's a story that was repeated across the new nation as the U.S. government and white settlers expanded west and tried to remove the native populations that stood in their way. In 1812, when Louisiana was made a state, the remaining area of the Louisiana Purchase was renamed the Missouri Territory. But just before it was being created, Missouri was rocked by a natural disaster so terrifying that many here quickly wondered whether living on the frontier was actually a good idea after all. What happened on May 22, 2011 will never be forgotten in western Missouri. On that hot, muggy afternoon, a supercell thunderstorm formed over southeastern Kansas. As the giant thundercloud grew and crossed the Missouri line, it spawned a massive E5 tornado that headed straight for the city of Joplin. The twister, with winds of more than 200 miles per hour, tore right through town, causing almost $3 billion worth of damage. Over 1,000 people were injured, 158 died, making it the deadliest tornado ever recorded in the U.S. Entire blocks of the city were demolished. Even though Missouri lies just outside Tornado Alley, dozens of twisters still touch down in the state every year. But 200 years before Joplin, just as Missouri was preparing to become a new U.S. territory, settlers in one frontier town discovered that devastating forces can also come from deep under this land and erupt suddenly with catastrophic force. The terrifying events they experienced are known as the New Madrid quakes. It all started at 2:15 a.m. on December 16, 1811. That's when a series of massive earthquakes suddenly started rocking the Midwest. They registered more than 7.5 on the Richter scale. The epicenter was the Missouri frontier town of New Madrid, which lies on the Mississippi River. The shockwaves spread out for hundreds of miles, affecting an area 10 times as large as that of the infamous 1906 quake in San Francisco. Some tremors even managed to wake up President James Madison in Washington, D.C., more than 700 miles away. But here in New Madrid, the ground shook so violently in the night that many thought the world was coming to an end. One eyewitness later wrote, "The screams of the affrighted inhabitants running to and fro, the cries of the fowls and beasts of every species formed a scene truly horrible. The inhabitants fled in every direction." Since the quake struck under the Mississippi River itself, they pushed the river's waters up into great swells, which caused, briefly, the Mississippi River to run backwards. On land, there was devastation everywhere. "A lot of people thinks that the devil has come here," one resident later said. What exactly caused this disaster here in southeastern Missouri remains a mystery. Recently, researchers discovered that massive quakes have actually rocked the Midwest since as early as 2350 BC. What they don't know is what exactly caused these earthquakes, since this area doesn't sit on the edge of tectonic plates. The Midwest is riddled with ancient faults, but scientists don't yet have a clear picture of why some of them are still seismically active. But based on past events, what they do know is that it's only a matter of time before the ground starts shaking again under this small Missouri town. one strange outcome of the New Madrid quakes was the creation of an odd-shaped appendage that now lies on Missouri's southern border, a geographical area known as Missouri's Boot Heel. Following the quakes, many here in the southern part of the Missouri Territory fled to safer ground. But a wealthy local rancher named John Hardiman Walker saw an opportunity. Instead of leaving, he bought up thousands of acres of land from those who fled for cheap. He came to be known as the Czar of the Valley. But a few years later, in 1818, as the boundary lines for the new state of Missouri were being drawn, Walker discovered that his vast holdings would actually end up in the new Arkansas Territory, not in the new state of Missouri. Since he wanted to be protected by Missouri state laws, he traveled all the way to Washington, shotgun in hand, to demand that Missouri's proposed southern border be changed to include his and his neighbors' land. He reportedly told them, "If you won't let us in, we'll have a revolution and start a nation of our own." Sure enough, by the time Missouri received statehood in 1821, Walker had succeeded. The southern border had been redrawn, and Missouri's 980 square mile Boot Heel was born. It may be the only time in American history that one individual used his money and power to dictate the actual borders of a U.S. state. Today, the Boot Heel is one of Missouri's most productive regions. There are great fields of cotton, endless acres of wheat, and vast farms of rice. When the rice is harvested, amazing patterns appear in the fields. They're created every year by the combines as they move back and forth to gather the rice and navigate the many levees in each field as they go. In the end, some rice fields look like giant works of art from the air. Missouri's Boot Heel also has its own star. It was here, in the small town of Kennett, surrounded by fertile fields, that singer Sheryl Crow was born in 1962. In 1980, she graduated from Kennett High School, where she was a drum majorette and an all-star athlete. Crow left Kennett to study music at the University of Missouri, and then headed to LA, where she sang backup for stars like Rod Stewart and Michael Jackson, before launching her own solo career. The University of Missouri, popularly known as Mizzou, was the first state university in the Louisiana Purchase Territory. Founded in 1839, here in Columbia. Mizzou's storied past is best symbolized by these 6 columns in the center of campus. They once belonged to the school's oldest building, which burned down in 1892 after an engineer switched on 400 light bulbs for a campus event. They had been wired 10 years earlier by students who were helping electrify the campus for the very first time. But the disaster had a silver lining. The University of Missouri decided to build 6 new buildings that now surround the columns and contain many of the departments for which Mizzou is now famous, including the oldest school of journalism in the world. Many famous names have walked its halls here in the corner of the quad. Long before playwright Tennessee Williams wrote A Streetcar Named Desire and The Glass Menagerie, he studied journalism at Mizzou. That is, until his father took him out of school and made him work in a shoe factory instead. Missouri native Brad Pitt was a journalism major, but decided to head off to Hollywood just a few credits short of earning his degree. Other famous Mizzou grads include Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, and Mad Men's John Hamm. But they are just a few of the big names that have called Missouri home. They include talk show host Rush Limbaugh, a Missouri native, and a young animator whose inspiration for Mickey Mouse came while working here in colorful Kansas City. It may seem odd that Missouri's largest city shares its name with its neighboring state, Kansas. But Kansas City was not named for the state of Kansas. It was named after the Kansas River that ends its journey here where its waters merge with the Missouri River. In fact, there are two Kansas cities, Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri. You can often tell a Missourian who comes from Kansas City because here in the western part of the state, many locals call their home state Missouri, not Missouri. Presidential candidates who jet into town often use Missouri, hoping that will endear them to voters. Kansas City was once a major hub for trains and cattle. The Kansas City Royals baseball team even got their name from a legendary livestock show here called the American Royal. Today, Kansas City is the heart of what has been called the Silicon Prairie, a high-tech boom that is sweeping across the Midwest, thanks in part to fiber optic broadband built by companies like Google. But a century ago, Kansas City put itself on the map when it built a major monument that would honor men and women from Missouri and Kansas who served in World War I. It's all centered around Liberty Memorial, an impressive carved stone tower that rises 217 feet over downtown. It was made into the National World War I Museum and Memorial in December 2014 under President Barack Obama. More than 156,000 Missouri residents fought in World War I. One local Kansas City resident who tried to enlist was a teenager named Walt Disney. But just 16 years old, he was too young, so he forged his birth certificate and got a job driving an ambulance for the Red Cross in France instead. After he returned to Kansas City, he studied graphic arts and in 1921 launched Laugh-O-Gram Studios with a partner to create animated cartoons. The building where Walt Disney started his first animation company still stands here on East 31st Street with a tribute to Disney on the facade. Disney himself claimed that his inspiration for Mickey Mouse came from working here. He said a little brown mouse used to inhabit one of his desks, which he soon trained to run in circles by tapping on its nose with a pencil. Laugh-O-Gram went bankrupt just 2 years later, but Disney took his inspiration for Mickey Mouse to Hollywood, and the rest is history. While Disney was trying to make a go of it here in Kansas City, so too were some of America's great jazz musicians. In the 1920s, this city was one of the great cradles of jazz, along with New York, Chicago, and New Orleans. It was all centered in Kansas City's African-American neighborhood at 18th and Vine. Jazz legends Big Joe Turner, Count Basie, and later Charlie Parker all performed in clubs here. Many of KC's jazz artists belong to a unique African-American musicians union as members of Local 627, which had its headquarters here at 18th and Vine. Today, nearby, a club known as the Blue Room keeps the history and spirit of Kansas City in the 1920s alive. During Prohibition, many came to 18th and Vine not just for jazz, but also to drink. Even though it was outlawed, liquor flowed freely in the clubs here. The rebel spirit of those days is one reason Kansas City earned the nickname Paris of the Plains. It was all possible thanks largely to a corrupt political boss named Tom Pendergast. His giant mansion south of town still stands as a reminder of his power and the many financial rewards of running what was known as the Pendergast Machine. Tom Pendergast didn't hold office, but everyone knew that Kansas City was Tom's town. He controlled everything from the cops to gambling to prostitution, but he made his fortune on city and state contracts after creating what was called the 10-year plan. It was a plan to help workers in Kansas City get through the Depression by creating a series of massive new developments that would rely on manual labor. Many families have claimed that they wouldn't have survived the Depression if not for Tom Pendergast. But he made millions for himself by ensuring that his ready-mixed concrete company got most of the 10-year plan's commissions. Those projects included two important concrete towers, the county courthouse and KC's new City Hall. Many call these two structures Pendergast's pyramids. His ready-mixed concrete company also built the vast municipal auditorium in the heart of downtown. It's hard to imagine a building from that time that would require more concrete than this one. But the Pendergast machine was brought to its knees in 1939 when he was convicted of tax evasion for not declaring and paying tax on a $750,000 insurance bribe. He did more than a year in Leavenworth and then retired to his more than 5,000 square foot mansion. Up until the 1940s, the neighborhood around the Pendergast mansion was basically for whites only. Deed restrictions barred African Americans from buying or occupying property here. That was also the case in neighborhoods around St. Louis. Despite the city's great wealth and industry at the turn of the 20th century, segregation limited blacks to certain neighborhoods, mostly on the fringe. One of the biggest was known as the Ville. It was home to Missouri music legend Chuck Berry, who lived in this red house, where he wrote the hits Johnny B. Good and Maybelline as one of the founders of rock and roll. In 1948, restrictions on where African Americans could live in St. Louis and across the nation were lifted. Many left the Ville and started moving into suburban communities that were primarily white. One of those became a flashpoint for what many have called the excessive use of deadly force by police officers. It's August 25th, 2014, and thousands are gathering at the Friendly Temple Missionary Baptist Church in St. Louis to mourn the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American man who was shot to death by a white police officer. It happened just a few miles northwest of downtown St. Louis, in the small Missouri city of Ferguson, on a street called Canfield Drive. On August 9th, a caller to 911 reported that a local convenience store had been robbed. Ferguson Market and Liquor. Nearby, at Canfield Green Apartments, a Ferguson police officer named Darren Wilson spotted Mr. Brown, who he believed fit the description of the suspect. There are conflicting accounts about what exactly happened next. But moments later, Michael Brown lay dead on this spot in the middle of Canfield Drive, fired on 6 times by Officer Wilson. The police would leave his covered body face down on the street for the next 4 hours. A makeshift memorial was later placed over the spot where he died. Within days, residents and others flooded onto West Florissant Avenue to protest the shooting and demand answers from the Ferguson police. But things got out of control. Ferguson's Quick Trip Mini Mart was looted and set on fire. Other businesses in town were vandalized and destroyed. Missouri's governor declared a state of emergency. And as National Guard troops moved in, West Florissant Avenue looked at times like a war zone. Several months later, in November 2014, a grand jury decided not to indict Officer Wilson. West Florissant Avenue descended into chaos again, and more than a dozen businesses were vandalized, including Ferguson Market and Liquor, where the story originally began. 4 months later, a U.S. Justice Department report criticized the Ferguson Police Department for racial bias, and the chief and other officers resigned. Michael Brown was laid to rest on August 25, 2014. On that day, all eyes in the nation were on Ferguson, Missouri. What happened here has caused many other communities across America to review police procedures and the use of deadly force. Long before there were trains and airplanes, America's rivers served as the nation's highways. And for the towns along their banks, ships, barges, and steamboats were their connections to the outside world. Hannibal, Missouri was no exception. This was once a bustling river port. Steamships pulled into its docks every day, with goods and people from afar. Hustlers, cowboys, slave owners, and newly converted Mormons from England all passed through this busy port town on their journeys west. There was probably no one in Hannibal more curious about the ships and people that landed here than a young boy named Samuel Clemens, who would later be known as Mark Twain. Clemens grew up in this house in the middle of town. It was here, climbing out windows in the night, to roam around the docks and ships in Hannibal, where he developed many of the memories of life on the Mississippi that he would turn into fiction as the writer Mark Twain. Ernest Hemingway said of Twain's classic novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, all modern American literature comes from this one book. At 11, Clemens left school and worked at printing presses in several cities before making his way to St. Louis, where he finally pursued his dream of becoming a riverboat pilot. In his book, Life on the Mississippi, Clemens wrote, "A pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived on the earth. The sound of that riverboat's whistle raised goosebumps as big as walnuts on me." Clemens took his pen name Mark Twain from a term that a pilot's apprentice called out when the water depth reached 12 feet, which was the depth the riverboat needed to pass. The curiosity that he developed as a child growing up in Missouri along the Mississippi ended up taking him around the world and inspiring him to write the stories that would make him a legend. Today, there are fewer vessels on the Mississippi River than there were in Mark Twain's day. And that means that today's barge pilots have much more time to keep their eyes on the skies for a glimpse of one of Missouri's most spectacular sights. Every fall, flocks of white pelicans use the Mississippi River as a superhighway to make their annual migrations from the northern U.S. and Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a route that's known as the Mississippi Flyway. Pelicans are clumsy on land, but they are excellent swimmers. It's why they prefer to follow waterways like the Mississippi on their journeys south. In the air, they are one of the most graceful birds in the world. Pelicans are designed to soar with wings that can span more than 9 feet. They often fly in formation to conserve energy. Scientists have discovered that pelicans flying in a V pattern like these use up to 20% less energy than birds that fly alone. That's because the birds can ride in the wake created by the pelicans in front of them. And they carefully follow each other's cues. When a pelican in front flaps its wings, the birds behind do too, in what looks like perfect synchronization. When they want to climb, these birds often catch a ride on pockets of hot rising air known as thermals, and then soar in circles. When they want to drop, they turn away from the wind and use gravity to let their bodies plummet. Come spring, they'll pass by here again, this time heading north. While the Mississippi River flows all the way down the eastern border of Missouri, the Missouri River cuts right across the state. The Missouri is the longest river in the nation, and there's a good reason it's also called the Big Muddy. Its waters are packed with silt. As the Missouri flows south on its 2,341-mile journey from Montana to the Mississippi, it devours the soil in the fields, farms, and ranches that line its banks. That's what makes it a big, wide, and muddy river. Some have called it the hungriest river ever created. Mark Twain is reported to have said, "The Missouri River is too thick to drink and too thin to plow." But the silt-laden waters of the Missouri also carry with them nutrients that have made the land around it into some of the most fertile in the state. It's why, back in the early 1800s, many thought of Missouri as the next great southern state, since the land along the banks of the Missouri River was perfect for growing southern crops like flax and tobacco. They even called this region Little Dixie. Farmers flocked here and created southern-style plantations like this one. Out back, its slave quarters are still standing. Slave labor turned the fields of Little Dixie into fortunes for their owners. There were more enslaved people in this region than anywhere else in what's now Missouri. It's one reason that Missouri's application for statehood triggered a fierce debate over slavery in Washington. Members of Congress feared that if Missouri were accepted as a slave state, pro-slavery states would outnumber free ones. But in March 1820, they voted in favor of what's famously known as the Missouri Compromise. Missouri would become a new slave state, but the new state of Maine, carved out of Massachusetts, would be free, thereby ensuring a balance of 12 free and 12 slave states in the Union. But the issue of slavery in Missouri continued to flare, especially here in St. Louis. By the 1840s, 2/3 of African Americans in St. Louis were enslaved. In 1847, 2 of those slaves launched a remarkable lawsuit here in the very courthouse that the Gateway Arch now frames. The final verdict in their case ended up shocking the nation and helping trigger the Civil War. The lawsuit, famously known as the Dred Scott case, was filed by Dred Scott and his wife Harriet. They came here to sue their owner, Irene Emerson, for their freedom. The case took more than 10 years to wind its way through the courts and ended here at the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., with a shocking verdict. In 1857, Supreme Court Justice Roger Brooke Taney read the majority ruling. Since Scott was black, and since his ancestors had been brought to America to be sold as slaves, the court had decided that Dred Scott was not actually a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, and therefore he had no right to sue for his freedom. The racist pro-slavery decision inflamed public opinion. It also angered a rising political star named Abraham Lincoln, who seized the issue and the moment to help lead his Republican Party to victory 3 years later in 1860. Having lost their case, Dred Scott and his wife were forced to remain slaves in Missouri until the son of one of Scott's former masters bought them and set them free. In his 63 years of life, Dred Scott had only 17 months of freedom. Eight years later, in January 1865, even before the Civil War was officially over, state delegates voted to end slavery in Missouri. By then, 27,000 Missourians had died in the war. Many were buried here, at Jefferson National Cemetery, south of St. Louis. Today, this cemetery is also the final resting place for tens of thousands of other servicemen and women who perished in conflicts that followed, from World War I right up to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. When soldiers returned home to Missouri after the Civil War, jobs were hard to find and tensions flared. One of those fighters soon became one of America's most legendary outlaws. On September 5, 1847, Jesse James was born on this small farm in Kearney, Missouri. It was here where the young Jesse developed his distrust of the U.S. government and the Union cause after federal soldiers arrived looking for information on Confederate guerrillas and ended up lynching his stepfather. James himself fought during the war as a member of a guerrilla group and arrived back at the farm having been wounded by Union soldiers during his surrender. Humiliated and enraged by the Confederates' defeat, Jesse James and his brother Frank turned to crime and murder. On February 13, 1866, up to 12 men rode into the town of Liberty, Missouri on horseback and robbed a savings bank at gunpoint. They made off with $60,000 and were never caught. Many believe this was Jesse James' first bank heist. Today, that former bank here in Liberty is home to the Jesse James Museum. Jesse and Frank and their gang were soon robbing banks, stagecoaches, and trains, and killed many who got in their way. From his perch here in the capital of Jefferson City, Missouri's governor wanted James captured, dead or alive. He placed a $10,000 bounty on his head. On April 3rd, 1882, Jesse James, who had recently moved into this small house in the town of St. Joseph, reached up to adjust a picture on the wall. While his back was turned, a man named Bob Ford, a brother of a member of the James gang, pulled out a pistol and shot Jesse James in the back of his head to cash in on the bounty. His body was returned to his family's farm and buried next to the house. It's said that his mother used to stand beside the road out front and sell pebbles from her legendary son's grave for 25 cents each. But Jesse James was just one of many criminals in Missouri after the Civil War. Here in Taney County, deep in the Ozarks, there was little law and order. Armed groups roamed the countryside, robbing, raping, and murdering those whose Civil War sympathies didn't match their own. In 1884, residents of the county formed a vigilante group known as the Bald Knobbers to track down the criminals. Their ranks quickly swelled into the hundreds. But soon, some of the vigilantes became outlaws themselves. They were famous for covering their faces with elaborate horned masks and raiding farms at night, stealing horses and cattle, and harassing and even murdering those who refused to join their ranks. It all came to a grisly end in 1889, after 3 Bald Knobbers were found guilty of participating in 2 murders. On May 10th, here in the town of Ozark, they were scheduled to be hanged outside the county courthouse. But as a crowd looked on, the public execution went terribly wrong. Ozark sheriff had miscalculated the length of the rope required, and 2 of the men had to be hanged a second time before they finally died. A witness described the executions as a scene of ghastliness. Ever since then, the Bald Knobbers have been a colorful part of Missouri legend. Stories of these vigilantes even helped give birth to one of the most famous theater towns in America. In 1959, 2 local residents of Branson, Missouri, decided to create a stage version of a popular novel called The Shepherd of the Hills by Harold Bell Wright. It featured rich tales of the Bald Knobbers. The show quickly became a hit. As more and more people flocked to this little Missouri town, new theaters and stages were built to entertain them. Actors flooded in from across the country, and Branson quickly became the biggest stage show town in the Midwest. But business really took off, and the number of theaters here doubled after CBS News called Branson the live country music capital of the universe in 1991. Like Vegas, Branson has its own strip, home to a replica of the Titanic, complete with its own bow wave. And there's the Dixie Stampede, a 35,000 square foot dinner theater owned by country music legend Dolly Parton. But when it comes to entertainment here in Missouri, nothing compares to the rivalry of 2 teams, especially when they face off in the World Series. When barge pilots guide their cargo down the Missouri River, they pass by a place called Herman. Today, at least half of Missourians have at least one parent of German descent, whose ancestors settled in communities like this one. With its German-style buildings and historic streets, Herman is often called the most beautiful town in Missouri. Most people probably don't think of Missouri as a land of wine, but German settlers planted wine grapes here, and soon the region was nicknamed the Missouri Rhineland, after Germany's premier wine region. By the early 20th century, The Stonehill Winery here in town was one of the largest in the nation, turning out more than 1 million gallons of wine a year. But when Prohibition arrived, Stonehill and other wineries in Missouri were forced to close. Stonehill ended up growing mushrooms instead. It wasn't until the 1960s that an entrepreneur and his family bought the vineyard, replanted its grapes, and started making wine again. Today, they produce more than 200,000 gallons a year. In the days when Herman was a bustling river port, there was practically a tavern on every corner and 2 local breweries to supply them. Today, a microbrewery called the Tin Mill keeps that tradition alive. The tradition of brewing beer in Missouri reaches far beyond Herman. In fact, it's one that's known to the world, thanks to a beer called Budweiser. It was here in Missouri that 2 of the most famous names in beer got their start. Missouri's Anheuser-Busch Brewery lies just south of the city of St. Louis, on the exact site where the original brewery that started it all was founded. In 1852, a German saloon owner opened his Bavarian brewery here. Financial troubles later forced him to sell, but its new owners quickly turned the brewery around, thanks in part to their pioneering use of pasteurization and refrigerated rail cars. They enabled cold beer to be delivered to bars and taverns hundreds of miles away. The fortunes earned from Anheuser-Busch beer allowed the Busch family to buy a large farm here in St. Louis that once belonged to Civil War hero and U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. They then built this 25-room mansion known as the Big House, which was completed in 1913. But less than a decade later, Prohibition set in, and the Busch family was forced to come up with ways to keep their company afloat. To do it, they sold ice cream and soda instead of beer. To celebrate the end of Prohibition, Anheuser-Busch sent out teams of Clydesdales, pulling beer wagons painted in the company's signature colors of red and gold, and a tradition was born. Today, these legendary workhorses are raised on their own farm, outside St. Louis, here at Warm Springs Ranch. Not any Clydesdale can become a Budweiser Clydesdale. They have to be more than 4 years old, more than 6 feet high, and have white stockings on all 4 feet. Horses under 1,800 pounds don't make the cut. Those that do get to stay are treated like royalty and are even chauffeured in 50-foot air-cushioned tractor trailers when they leave the farm for duty on marketing tours. The friendship between dogs and Clydesdales, famously featured in Super Bowl commercials, is not entirely fiction. Dalmatians have actually been traveling with the Budweiser Clydesdales since the 1950s. And a lot has changed since then. Today, the company is part of AB InBev, a global beverage conglomerate based in Belgium. But that hasn't stopped Budweiser from flowing from the taps here at Busch Stadium, home field of the St. Louis Cardinals. The team got its start back in 1892 as the St. Louis Browns, but was given the name the Cardinals in 1900, after a reporter overheard a fan call the team's red-colored jerseys a lovely shade of cardinal. The name stuck, and the St. Louis Cardinals went on to win 11 World Series titles, led by baseball legend Stan the Man Musial. He was one of the greatest hitters in the sport's history. Strangely enough, of his 3,630 hits, exactly half of them came during home games. But in 1985, the Cardinals suffered a humiliating World Series defeat at the hands of their own Missouri rivals, the Kansas City Royals. Game 7 was played here, at the Royals' legendary Kauffman Field, where the Royals trounced the Cardinals 11-0 to win the 1985 title. The Royals didn't get another chance for a World Series win until 2014. During that series, they finally lost to the San Francisco Giants 3-2, to the dismay of many here in Kansas City and across the Midwest. Standing next to Kauffman Field is Arrowhead Stadium, home of the Kansas City Chiefs. In 2013, during a game against the San Francisco 49ers, Arrowhead was deemed to have the loudest crowd roar of any stadium in the world by the Guinness Book of World Records. when Chiefs and Royals fans want to get away from the crowds and the noise, all they have to do is head south into the rolling hills and forests of Missouri's Ozark Mountains, or race across the lakes that fill its valleys. Missouri is a land rich with stories that touch the heart of the nation, but it's also a place with plenty of space to roam. From the wild banks of the Big Muddy, across seemingly endless fertile fields, to the mist-covered tops of its highest peaks that tumble down to ancient prairies, and a towering city known as the Paris of the Plains. There's simply nothing like the colorful state of Missouri.